Today's scripture reading comes from Luke chapter 6, verses 27 through 38. But I say to you who are willing to hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on the cheek, offer the other one as well. If someone takes your coat, don't withhold your shirt either. Give to everyone who asks, and don't demand your things back from those who take them. Treat them in the same way that you want them to treat you. If you love those who love you, why should you be commended? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, why should you be commended? Even sinners do that. If you lend to those whom you expect repayment, why should you be commended? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be paid back in full. Instead, love your enemies. Do good and lend expecting nothing in return. If you do, you will have a great reward. You will be acting the way the children of the Most High act, for he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked people. Be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate. Don't judge, and you won't be judged. Don't condemn, and you won't be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good portion, a packed down, firmly shaken, and overflowing, will fall into your lap. The portion you give will determine the portion you receive in return.
It's a tough passage. Yeah, a very tough passage. It's so tough it shows up twice: Matthew 5 through 7, and then Luke 6 and 7, and both of them equally as difficult. So instead of trying to break down just like theory and all of that for you, I want to tell you like a whole bunch of stories. Is that okay? Can I just tell you a bunch of stories? I find that stories hit better, I think, when things are difficult. I want to read you a little bit from this book by Shane Claiborne and Chris Hall called Jesus for President. Anybody read this book? One person, two people? Anybody know Shane Claiborne? A couple people? Yep.
We shared Christmas carols together once.
That's true. You shared a hymnal at my house. Shane Claiborne and others started something called The Simple Way in North Philly. It is, so the church historically, every couple hundred years or so, gets a little too comfortable with power and empire and gets a little too rich and loses the gospel. And so when that happens, there are intrepid groups of monastics, is what they call them, monks and nuns and wild people who go out to the fringes, usually out to the wilderness, the desert, the mountains, somewhere like that, and they try to radically get back to the gospel. And so there is no wilderness left in our world. The wilderness that is in our world is in our cities, where people have been left behind and forgotten. And so they hopped on and somewhat started this movement called the New Monastics, in which they moved into the cities, and they committed themselves to radical poverty and to caring for their neighbor and love and peacemaking above all else. And they started The Simple Way and a series of intentional Christian communities connected with them. I lived in one of those communities for a number of years and have some wild stories from that time. But I want to read you a story that illustrates what Jesus is talking about from this book. If anybody wants to... Sorry. If anybody wants to borrow this at some point, just let me know. It's still very relevant today. So in this story, he and a boy named Kasim, who was a neighborhood boy that was friends with The Simple Way, were walking down the street. They were going down an alley and noticed behind them a group of teenage boys walking behind them. Anyone who has been in the city knows the scariest thing in the world is a group of teenage boys. And they looked bored and they looked like they wanted to cause trouble. So seeing that, he decided to try to disrupt what was about to happen and stopped and turned around and said, "Hi, my name is Shane. This is my friend Kasim. What is your names?" Which totally threw them off. There's a sort of script that you expect to happen, and when it gets thrown off, you don't quite know what to do. And so that bought them some time. But as they kept walking, they noticed that a couple more boys had joined the group, and they started shouting angry words at them. So they regrouped to build momentum towards a brawl. They ran after us, throwing some rocks and bottles, and I noticed 2 of them now carried broomsticks from the trash. We picked up the pace a bit, and then I looked at Kasim and said, "No, don't run." We turned back, and before we knew it, one of them had clocked Kasim on the side of the head with a stick. I said firmly, "Why would you do that? We haven't done anything to hurt you." They laughed. Then they started hitting me with a broomstick until it broke over my back. At this point, I decided to bust out a can of holy anger. I looked at them in the eyes and said as forcefully as I could, "You are created in the image of God, every single one of you, and you were made for something better than this. Kasim and I are followers of Jesus, and we will not fight, but we will love you no matter what you do to us." That wasn't exactly what they expected or hoped for. They looked at each other, startled for a bit. For the first time, they were quiet, and then they scurried off in every direction. I'll never forget what Kasim said afterwards. "Shane, why am I taking boxing lessons?" We laughed at the irony of it, having just experienced a prime chance to implement some of his mad skills. I asked Kasim what he thought would have happened if he had chosen to fight. It probably would have gotten ugly," he said. "They might have been bloody, and we probably would have been really bloody. No one would have left any nicer, that's for sure." I asked Kasim if he thought Jesus was happy with how we acted. He thought about it, and then he nodded with a smile. I told him that, honestly, I wasn't sure what Jesus would have done if he was in our place. But there are 2 things I know Jesus would not have done. He would not have fought, and he would not have run. I told him Jesus might have thought of something else, or he might have done something weird to throw them off, as he often seemed to do, like writing on the road with sidewalk chalk, "You're better than this," or maybe pulling candy from a pigeon's mouth for them. But I thought that Jesus was happy with how we acted, that we were good representatives, good witnesses of Christ to them. Not only did we refuse to hit, but we refused to hate. Kasim agreed, and then we prayed for them together. And finally, as he was leaving, Kasim reminded me that each one of those boys had to go to bed thinking about what they did that day, and so did we. There is this idea within the history of Christian peacemaking that we call nonviolent resistance, that lives in the space between fighting back and running away. That is neither fight nor flight, but is something bold and dangerous and creative and loving in between that. There is an ancient tradition going back to the very beginning of our faith with Jesus himself that demonstrates the power that comes with this method. And so many people have read these passages from Jesus. Turn the other cheek. Give your cloak. Don't say no to anybody who asks you for things. And they have imagined Jesus saying, "I would like you to be a spineless pushover." And immediately someone would say, "Well, what if somebody broke into your house and attacked your grandma? You wouldn't fight back?" There's always that. Always that. There's no creativity when it comes to that. But I would like to take a few moments to teach you a third way, a more excellent way. A lot of these points, by the way, are taken from this brilliant book, Jesus and Nonviolence by Walter Wink. I would highly recommend that you read this book at some point in your life. If you would like some ideas about what to do if somebody does break into your house and attack your grandma. As rare as that is to actually happen. So there are 3 ways that we resist like Jesus, where we don't fight and we don't flight, but we resist and transform. There are 3 ways that we resist. We resist with dignity. Okay? This is important. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Jesus does not want us to be doormats. Jesus does not want us to be spineless pushovers. Jesus does not want us to let evil run rampant in this world and over us and over the most vulnerable. Jesus does not want any of that. And at no point in Jesus' life or words does he suggest as such. What Jesus wants us to do is to stand up, to refuse to allow our dignity to be stripped from us. This is one of the most powerful tools of oppressors. When they strip people of their dignity and they make them feel like less of a human, because not only does it make it easier to subject them, but it also makes it easier for the oppressor to live with themselves. They can sleep well at night knowing that you're not fully human or you are lesser than them. This has happened throughout all of history. I could be up here all day giving you examples of times when oppressive regimes have dehumanized people, not only as a way of making them docile and do what they want, but also of making themselves feel superior and able to sleep at night. When you assert your dignity, when you refuse to be treated like a victim, like a less than human, you are forcing them to come to terms with what they have become. That is a powerful, powerful statement. You expose the injustice, the inhumanity in the system and in themselves. You remember this picture that was all over the news? This is one of my favorite protest photos. I could find nothing about her afterwards as a person, other than a police officer who said that there was a standoff with police in riot gear, and there were groups of protesters, and this woman stepped forward from the crowd and simply stood there without any pretense that she was going to act violently, but also with no pretense that she was going to be moved. She was going to stand there against these riot police who were going to treat them like animals, and she was going to insist that they treat her like a human. And in so doing, exposed the system around them. We must resist with dignity. You'll notice in Shane's story, he didn't cower. He introduced himself as a human. He said to them that you are created in the image of God, and that we likewise are, and that we will love you. He didn't beg. He didn't plead. He didn't act like a poor, sad, beaten animal. He forced them to come to terms with themselves because he refused to give up his own dignity. We see Jesus doing this as well. From the cross, Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." When Jesus refuses to give up his dignity, he forces the Romans to come to terms with who they have become. We must also resist with creativity. This is the best part. This is my favorite part. This is when people say, well, if somebody breaks in and attacks my grandmom, of course I'm going to fight back. Because we have stopped thinking. We have stopped imagining. We have said to ourselves that fighting back with violence is the best way to fight back. And so that is what we are going to do. Many of us have even come up with scenarios in our heads, and we've imagined them. We've bought guns for protecting our families and our homes, and we have fantasized about a home break-in, and you're going to grab your gun from under your pillow, and you're going to save your family, and everything's going to be great, and you're going to be the hero. We fantasize about that, but how much time do we spend imagining creative solutions to disarm and disrupt? Jesus calls us to break cycles of hate in ways that surprise, in ways that disarm people. You see, when a person is coming to you with violence or with oppression, they have a certain script in their head of how they imagine it's going to go. They're expecting violence. They are either violent response or submission. They're expecting one or the other. They are not expecting something totally out of the blue. there's a story in which these religious people bring a woman caught in the act of adultery to Jesus, and they're trying to trap him. And they're like, hey, the law says we should stone her. What are we going to do? You going to tell us to break the law or what? And Jesus says, he who is without sin cast the first stone. And then the text says he starts writing in the sand. We don't know what he's writing in the sand. He grabs a stick and he starts doodling in the sand. That, to me, is one of those situations where Jesus just does a weird thing that nobody expects, and it throws them off. And for a moment, now that the narrative has been disrupted, grace can find its way in. Reason can find its way in. A person gives the opportunity to change. If a person strikes you on the cheek, turn to them the other. What do you think that means? When a person strikes you on the cheek, that is a disrespectful strike. That is most likely a backhand. That is how you hit somebody who is subservient, somebody who is lower, under you. By turning the other cheek, you are forcing them to look you in the eyes and slap you with their open palm. You are breaking what they assume is going to happen. When somebody takes your coat, strip down naked and give them your whole outfit, they're not going to see that coming. Look, Jesus said it. I didn't make that up. In Matthew, it says that if somebody forces you to walk a mile, walk an extra mile with them, because in those days, Roman soldiers could force anybody to carry their packs for 1 mile. And so what Jesus says is, yeah, go ahead and do what they say, but then go an extra mile to force them to break the law, to expose that they themselves are fairly corrupt in that way. When it says if somebody sues you for your coat, go into court and be like, all right, yeah, you can have it, and here's all of my money as well. They're not going to see that coming. And in that moment that you do something weird and disruptive, their whole script is down, their walls go down, and there is the ability to do something else. I remember a story of a friend of mine who woke up one morning and looked down the stairs to find somebody in her home ransacking her stuff. And she called down to the person, would you like me to make you some tea? And that was enough to break the moment and to begin the process of justice and reconciliation. If she had yelled down, get the out of my house, he who was prepared for violence would have met with violence. If she had yelled, oh my gosh, call the cops, he who was ready for somebody to freak out would have likewise resorted to violence. Instead, she disrupted with creativity. Now, there's another great book called What Would You Do? By John Howard Yoder. It's edited by him, but it's really written by a whole bunch of people who answer this question of, well, what would you do if blank? Because the answer is always, this is the one time it's okay to respond with violence. And they take all of those and they creatively imagine what they would do to disrupt the scenario and introduce the possibility of reconciliation. It's a good book. It's fun. You should read that one as well. I'm giving you a lot of books to read today. Maybe it's on audiobook somewhere. So we must resist with dignity. We must resist with creativity. And we must resist with love. Does anybody know Daryl Davis? Some of you may have heard Daryl's story. It is wild, and it is very much the exception and not the rule. Daryl is a piano player, an incredible piano player. And he was playing at a club one time in 1983 in Frederick, Maryland, and just doing his thing. And after the performance, this man came up to him and said, wow, you play just like Jerry Lee Lewis. I have never seen a black man play like Jerry Lee Lewis. And he said to him, where do you think Jerry Lee Lewis learned how to play piano? He was like, what do you mean? He learned from black musicians how to play that style of piano. And he said, no, that can't be true. That is not true at all. And Daryl said, I know him. He's a friend of mine. And we have talked about this many, many, many times. Here are 6 or 7 different musicians that you need to go to your record store and you need to look up if you are interested in this kind of piano as played by the people who invented this style of piano. And this man insisted that it couldn't be true. It couldn't possibly be true because Jerry Lee Lewis was white and this is white music. And the man was, Daryl was just completely out of sorts. And he said, well, tell you, come back to another show that we do. And this man's friend said, I don't know if that's going to happen. And he looked kind of awkward and he was like, why not? And he's like, well, he's a part of the Klan. And Daryl looked at him and was like, oh, what? And the guy looked at him and he was like, yeah, and he pulled out his card and he showed him. And a simple question came into his head. He said, how can you possibly hate me if you don't know me? And it was born out of genuine curiosity. He really honestly wanted to know. And that question, it stuck with him. He actually met with this guy a couple more times because this man who still held these awful beliefs still wanted to come see him play because he wanted to get all of his other white friends to come out here and check out this black man who can play like Jerry Lee Lewis. And they met a few more times and they built this, I don't really want to call it a friendship. He calls it a friendship, but a mutual sort of respect until this man, having now met Daryl a half a dozen times and talked with him and gotten to know him, realized he could no longer be a part of this organization. And he gave up his membership. And he actually had to give up his robes because he hadn't paid them off yet. And years later, Daryl Davis had just gotten kind of obsessed with learning more about these hate groups. This idea that somebody could hate him without ever knowing him just drove him wild. So he did this thing. He told his secretary, he said, hey, can you call up Roger Kelly, who is the Grand Dragon of Maryland? And can you tell him that I am writing a book on the Klan and I would like to do an interview with him? Do not tell him that I'm black. Don't lie if he asks, but don't lead with that. And so this guy showed up for this interview with an armed guard with him, completely offended that this black man would want to speak with him. And the interview was completely tense. He wrote a book about this. There's a documentary about this. I would recommend you check those out as well, because the interview is wild and it is tense, but it is also kind and respectful in a way that makes Roger Kelly feel like a little bit of a monster. Because Daryl refuses to be victimized, and he keeps asking these honest and almost naive questions about this grand master of the Klan, about, so what have I done? Tell me, what have I done? Why me personally? Why do you hate me personally? And he kept asking these questions he knew the answer to, but he kept asking the questions so that this man would be forced to say them to his face. And after the interview, this guy was like really impressed, and they kept in touch over time, and they talked on the phone over time. And for some reason, this Grand Master invited Daryl to come to Klan rallies, and he showed up. I know, this is why I'm saying he's the exception and not the rule. This is not something that everybody should be doing, but for some reason, Daryl has been given this amazing spiritual gift. And he went and he spoke with them. And he continued this conversation. And Roger, over time, lost the ability to see Daryl as an enemy and could only see him as a human. And once he saw him as a human, he could no longer hate him in theory, because proximity is always the cure for prejudice. So after these years of kind of friendship, Roger walked away from the Klan. He gave Daryl his robes as a trophy, and brought all of these other Klansmen to meet this guy and introduced him. And the next Grand Wizard likewise left the clan. 3 of them in Maryland left the clan such that they no longer had an organizational structure, and the entire organization in Maryland crumbled and fell apart because no one was there to lead it anymore, and they never were able to rebuild it. Over 200 Klansmen have left the KKK because they met Daryl. For Daryl, it was never about being right. It was never about proving to these people that they were wrong. It was about giving them an opportunity to be better. Keeping a door open for them where at any point they could come through if they should so choose, if their heart should be so changed. And that is an incredibly dangerous thing to do. Every time he did this, he put his own body on the line. He put his family on the line. His children, his wife, everyone who loves him was in danger every time he chose to do this thing. Okay? I feel like I need to say that. That's why this is the exception and not the rule. That's why this is the hardest possible thing to do. When Jesus says, turn the other cheek, he is not saying, take the easy road. Jesus is saying, take the hardest possible road. Loving your enemy is not weakness. It is the hardest thing that you will ever do. See, like I said, most people think that there are only 2 options when you're wronged, that you fight back or you run away. You either meet violence with violence and crush your enemy, or you just submit and retreat and let injustice win. But Jesus teaches us that there is a creative third way. It is neither fight nor flight. It is resistance that transforms and does not let those in power get away with it. It takes, honestly, no courage to punch someone. It takes little courage to run away. But it takes incredible faith, deep strength, and radical love to stand your ground without becoming your enemy. And that's the wisdom of the cross, which Paul tells us is foolishness to the world. The world saw it as weakness. The disciples, they saw it as failure. The soldiers saw it as their victory. But what looked like defeat was actually Jesus breaking the cycles of violence forever and showing us a better way. Because this is how Rome defeated their enemies, right? It didn't just destroy them. It humiliated them. It dehumanized them. The cross was meant to destroy not only a person's body, but their legacy as well. But Jesus flipped this whole thing on its head, showing how brittle authoritarianism really is and how we overcome it. Systems of oppression work best when you surrender your dignity and your agency, and you believe the lie that there is no other way. They goad you into fighting dirty so you lose the moral high ground, or giving up and collapsing in a hopeless pile. They present you with that false choice, but Jesus calls us to a higher way that is harder, that is often less intuitive, but in the end is the only true way forward. So I'm wondering, friends, how all of this strikes you. I don't have any particular questions. Because I just threw a whole lot of stuff at you. So I'm wondering what is rising to the surface right now in your heart, in your mind.